She wouldn't let go of it. Not when she ate. Not when she slept. Not when the morning staff arrived and the enclosure filled with the soft noise of the day beginning around her. The tiny gorilla sat in the corner, pale light coming through the mesh walls, the smell of damp hay and warm milk settling into the air, and she held the same worn toy pressed against her chest, every second of the day. It was small, a stuffed animal, brown and faded, one ear slightly flattened from weeks of constant pressure, the kind of thing you'd find forgotten at the bottom of a donation bin somewhere. Unremarkable, worn down to almost nothing, except she never put it down. The enclosure was modest but clean, fresh hay on the floor, a low wooden platform in the center, a water bowl that the staff refilled twice a day, the kind of space designed for function first, for survival, for recovery, with comfort coming second, slowly as trust allowed. She had claimed the far corner, not the warmest spot, not the most sheltered, just the corner where two walls met, and the world could only reach her from one direction. She sat there every morning when the staff arrived. She sat there every evening when the light changed and the facility grew quiet. In between she moved only slightly, shifting position, adjusting her grip, but always returning to that same corner, always with the toy held flat against her chest, always with that same expression that wasn't quite blank, and wasn't quite sad, but existed somewhere in the space between the two. Even during feeding, when the staff brought warm bottles and pieces of soft fruit and set them carefully within reach, one hand stayed wrapped around the toy, tight, not playful, not the casual grip of an animal holding something out of habit, tight, deliberate, continuous, like she was afraid that the moment her attention shifted, the moment she let herself be distracted by hunger or warmth or the presence of another living thing, it would be gone. The other young animals in the facility reached out with both hands when food arrived. They grabbed and explored and sometimes dropped things and looked startled at themselves. They were loud in the way young animals are loud, curious and unguarded and fully present in their bodies. She used one hand. The other never moved. One hand eating, one hand holding, eyes low, shoulders curved inward around the thing she carried like she was trying to make herself and it into one object. At first the staff thought it was normal. Baby animals form attachments to objects. It's documented behavior, especially in rescues, especially in animals who arrive without family, without the social structure their nervous systems were built to exist inside. You see it in primates particularly. A blanket, a rope toy, something soft, something consistent, something that stays when everything else has gone. So they gave her space. They noted it in the log and kept their distance and let her be. But something about the way she held it made people slow down when they passed her enclosure. Not stop necessarily, not stare, just slow. The way you slow near something that your body registers before your mind catches up. The way a sound just below the threshold of hearing still changes the quality of a room. This was different. She didn't play with it. She didn't shake it or drag it across the floor, or use it the way young gorillas use objects that interest them, as tools, as projectiles, as things to investigate, and discard, and return to. She showed no curiosity about it at all. She just held it, pressed flat against her chest, right at the center, right where her heartbeat was, and sat with her arms curved around it, and her chin sometimes resting on top of it, and her eyes somewhere far away. The toy disappeared under her small arms almost completely. If you weren't looking for it, if you passed the enclosure quickly without paying attention, you might not even notice it was there. But it was always there, and sometimes quietly, without warning, without any visible trigger, she would rock, just slightly, back and forth, a small, slow movement, barely visible, the kind of motion that looks automatic, involuntary, like breathing, like the way a body in pain sometimes finds a rhythm without being told to. She never changed her expression when she did it. She never looked around to see if anyone was watching. She just rocked, slow and steady, with the toy held against her chest and her eyes unfocused, and the rest of the world existing somewhere outside whatever place she had retreated to. Back and forth, back and forth. The staff started to linger, not formally, not as a documented observation shift, just individually, quietly, pausing near her enclosure when they passed, staying a few seconds longer than their route required, watching without quite being able to explain why they were watching. One of the senior caregivers said it later, trying to articulate what it was that made the behavior feel different from other attachment cases she had seen. She said it wasn't the holding. It wasn't even the rocking. It was the sounds. She made small sounds sometimes, very small. Not distress calls, nothing that registered as alarm or pain in any clinical sense. Not the sounds a sick animal makes, or a frightened one. Just quiet, low, almost shapeless sounds that seemed to escape from her without intention. Not a cry, not a call, something between, something older. Something that didn't seem directed at anything in the room but outward, or inward, somewhere the staff couldn't follow. One of the younger caregivers stood outside her enclosure one evening, after the rest of the staff had gone, and just listened. She stood there for a long time. She said later she couldn't explain what it made her feel, only that she couldn't leave. That something about those sounds in that quiet facility, with the light going low and the tiny gorilla rocking in her corner, made it impossible to simply walk away and close up for the night like nothing was happening. So she stayed, and listened, and something shifted in how the whole team looked at her after that. Because that behavior, that small, private, repetitive motion in the corner of a rescue enclosure, wasn't random. They were certain of it now, and so they did what caregivers do when behavior stops making surface sense. They went back to the beginning. They pulled her file. They sat down with the intake documents, the field notes, the sparse and often incomplete record of how she had come to be here, and they read, and then they read it again, and then the room got very quiet. Because the records didn't tell the whole story, but they told enough. She had been rescued recently, very recently. The intake form was sparse the way early rescue paperwork always is, filled out quickly, in the field by people whose first priority was keeping a small animal alive long enough to get her somewhere safe. The handwriting in places was rushed. Some fields were left blank. The circumstances column contained only a few words, clinical and insufficient. But what was there told enough of the story for the staff to sit with the file in their hands and feel the shape of what had happened, even where the words ran out. She was young, younger than the form could fully capture in numbers. Young in the way that registers not as a statistic but as a physical fact, in the size of her hands, the roundness of her face, the way she still moved with the slight unsteadiness of a body that hadn't yet grown fully into itself. Too young to be without a mother, too young to be alone in any sense that her biology understood. At that age, a gorilla infant should still be in contact with her mother almost constantly, pressed against her body during the day, sleeping curled against her warmth at night, learning the world from that safe anchored position, watching, listening, absorbing, with the permanent reassurance of heartbeat and breath and smell and presence beneath her. That's what that age is supposed to feel like. Instead she was here. No mother found, no group located, no family members recovered, no social structure of any kind, waiting for her or coming for her, or aware she existed, just her, small and quiet in a corner, and a worn stuffed animal pressed against her chest. The staff read the file slowly. They passed it around. They asked the questions rescuers always ask when the record is thin. What happened before this? What did the field team actually see? What aren't these words saying? And they got the answers those questions usually get. Incomplete ones, uncertain ones, the kind of answers that leave you reconstructing a story from the edges because the center is gone. But the edges were enough. The rocking, the holding, the attachment that never loosened and never shifted, and never behaved the way simple object preference behaves. Standing there with the papers in their hands, it stopped looking like one thing and started looking like another. She wasn't playing, she was coping. The distinction sounds simple when you say it aloud, but it changes everything you see when you look at an animal. It changes the questions you ask. It changes what the behavior means and what it costs and what kind of response it requires. Playing is outward. Playing reaches toward the world. Coping turns inward. Coping holds something close because the world has proven that things disappear. They began watching her differently after that. Not casually, not from a distance, not as a logged observation among many others. They watched her the way you watch something you now understand matters in a way you initially failed to recognize, with attention that had weight to it. And the more they watched, the more they saw. She avoided open space. When the enclosure door was left slightly open for airflow, she moved away from it. Not frantically, not in obvious distress, just quietly, deliberately, pressing herself toward the corner where the two walls met, and the world was reduced to a manageable angle. She didn't avoid the open space because it scared her in any single moment. She avoided it because open space means exposure. It means visibility from all directions. It means nothing solid at your back. She needed solid things at her back. She needed to feel contained. She stayed close to the toy with the consistency of something that cannot afford to be casual about proximity. When it shifted while she slept, when it moved even slightly away from her body, she reached for it before her eyes were open, before awareness, before thought. Her hand would find it in the dark, pull it back, and she would settle again, breathing slower, the rocking stilling, without ever fully waking. She became anxious without it in ways that didn't announce themselves loudly. She didn't scream. She didn't charge the walls or display, or make the kind of distress that's easy to see and easy to document. She just became less, quieter than her usual quiet, smaller than her usual small, like a light source losing power, still present, still technically on, but diminished in a way that changed the quality of everything around it. The staff noted it, talked about it in quiet voices at the end of shifts, tried to find clinical language for something that kept resisting clinical language, and then one afternoon it happened. During a routine check, a staff member moving through the enclosure to refresh the water, adjust the hay, the toy slipped, just for a moment, a slight disturbance underfoot, a shift in the bedding, and the worn stuffed animal tumbled away from where she sat. Not far, the length of a human arm, maybe slightly more, but distance isn't always physical. For her in that moment, it might as well have been the length of the world. She panicked, not loudly. She didn't scream or thrash or charge. She didn't make the sounds that bring staff running, but her eyes changed. Every person who was present in that enclosure that afternoon said the same thing afterward, independently, without comparing notes. They had never seen anything like it. Pure, quiet, total desperation. The kind that has gone so deep it no longer has the energy for noise. The kind that moves fast and efficiently because it has learned that there is no time. She scrambled across the floor, retrieved it, pulled it back against her chest with both arms this time, not one, and held it there with every part of herself, rocking faster than usual, making those small sounds in rapid, almost breathless succession. It took a long time for her to settle. The staff stood still and did not speak. Because in that moment, watching her rock and hold and make those sounds in the corner of a rescue enclosure in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, they finally understood. The toy wasn't a preference. It wasn't comfort in any simple sense. It was something she could not exist without. And now they needed to understand why. The toy was replacing something, not comfort, not warmth in any general sense, not the soft and replaceable feeling of having something familiar nearby. A presence, a specific, irreplaceable, fundamental presence that had existed every moment of her life from the very beginning, and then, without warning, without preparation, without anything her small nervous system could have used to brace itself, was gone. She had lost her mother, not gradually, not in the way that some separations happen, slowly, over time with space for the nervous system to register the change and begin, however painfully, to adapt, suddenly, completely, at an age when the loss was not just emotional but biological, when her body was still calibrated to another body, when her heartbeat had learned to regulate itself against another heartbeat, when her sense of safety, her sense of the world, her sense of existing at all, was inseparable from a warmth and a smell, and a sound that was simply, one day no longer there, and then the world was very large, and very cold, and very, very quiet. The way she held the toy pressed flat against her chest, right at the center, right where a mother's body would be, was not random attachment. It was not preference, or habit, or the simple comfort-seeking that any young animal displays. She was recreating something. The pressure of being held. The sensation of something solid and warm against her chest. The feeling, however approximate, however insufficient, of not being alone in the most fundamental sense that a gorilla infant understands aloneness. The way she rocked, slow, steady, rhythmic, automatic, was not self-soothing in the clinical sense that the phrase implies. It was the motion of being carried. The motion her body had known before it knew anything else, pressed against her mother moving through the forest, the world rocking gently around her from that safe and elevated place. Her body was doing the only thing it knew to do with a loss it had no framework to process. It was going back to the last thing it remembered as safe, and holding there. Everything changed after that conversation. The shift in the staff wasn't loud or dramatic. There were no announcements, no formal meetings, no documents amended with new language. It happened the way real understanding happens, quietly and irreversibly, like a light changing in a room. They stopped seeing a toy, they started seeing a shape, the outline of something missing, the approximate form of something that had been present and was now gone, and that she was trying, with the only tools available to her, to reconstruct. And they understood that their job was no longer just to keep her alive and fed and safe in the immediate physical sense. Their job was to give her something real to replace what the toy was standing in for, not quickly, not clumsily, not with the kind of forced affection that overwhelms an animal who has learned to be careful about what it trusts. Slowly, consistently, with patience that didn't flinch when progress reversed or stalled or disappeared for days at a time. They began spending more time near her enclosure, not interacting, not yet, not directly, just being present, visible, sitting nearby during quiet periods, moving slowly and predictably through spaces she could see, talking to each other in low voices that she could hear and learn the rhythm of without being required to respond to. They became a constant, the same faces at the same times, the same gentle patterns of movement and sound, the same unhurried presence that showed up and showed up and showed up again until her nervous system could begin to register it, not as intrusion but as landscape. They introduced routines so deliberate they were almost ceremonial, the same soft voice before the food arrived, the same slow approach, the same careful withdrawal that left her space to remain exactly as she was without the pressure of expectation. They gave her something her body had almost forgotten existed: predictability. The knowledge built slowly through repetition that some things in the world do not leave, and she began so slowly that on any individual day it was nearly invisible to change. She still held the toy, she still rocked, she still pressed herself into the corner where the walls met and the world could only reach her from one direction. But she started looking up more. Brief glances at first, a moment of eye contact that lasted less than a second before she looked away, a slight turn of the head toward the sound of a familiar voice, a momentary pause in the rocking when a known face appeared at the mesh, then longer, then something that wasn't yet trust but was the first condition of trust: the willingness to notice, to register, to allow the presence of another living thing into awareness without immediately contracting away from it. Weeks passed. Then one morning, quiet, unremarkable, the facility still settling into the day, one of the caregivers sat down near the mesh wall of her enclosure, not facing her directly, not approaching the mesh, just sitting, close but sideways, present but unthreatening, the way you sit near something wild that you want to know you are not a danger. The tiny gorilla looked at her for a long time. Then she looked down at the toy in her arms, then back at the human. Something moved across her face that wasn't quite a decision but was the thing that comes just before a decision, and she let go. Just for a moment. Her arms loosened, the toy shifted, and in that small open space, in those few seconds of hands that weren't holding anything, she reached forward, toward the mesh, toward the human on the other side of it, toward something real. The caregiver didn't move, didn't reach back, didn't make a sound, just stayed exactly where she was, and let herself be reached for. She still keeps the toy. It sits near her now, not clutched against her chest, not locked inside both arms with the full strength of a small body that cannot afford to let go. Just near her, placed in the corner of her enclosure the way you place something you value without needing to hold it constantly to be sure it still exists, within reach, present without being desperate. The difference between the way she holds it now and the way she held it in those first weeks is the kind of difference that doesn't photograph well. It doesn't make a clean before and after. It lives in the subtlety of grip, in the frequency of glancing down at it to confirm it's there, in the question of whether she reaches for it first when something startles her, or whether she looks up instead. She looks up now. More often than not she looks up. She explores the enclosure in ways she didn't before. Not boldly. She is not a bold animal, may never be a fully bold one, and that is not a failure of healing but a fact of what she has been through. Some experiences change the dimensions of a life permanently, and the work is not to pretend otherwise but to build something real within whatever dimensions remain. But she moves. She investigates the corners she used to avoid. She touches things with the hand that used to always be full. She approaches the water bowl with both hands free, and drinks without scanning the enclosure first for something that might slip away while she's distracted. Small things, ordinary things, the kinds of things that would be invisible in an animal who had never lost anything, and that are everything in one who had. She interacts with the staff who became consistent for her, who showed up and kept showing up until her nervous system had no choice but to register them as part of the landscape rather than as variables that might one day disappear. She makes eye contact now with the caregivers she knows best. Sometimes she moves toward the mesh when they sit nearby, not touching, not vocalizing, just orienting herself in their direction the way a plant orients toward light. Not dramatically, not with any of the large gestures that make good stories, just quietly and repeatedly choosing presence over withdrawal. That is its own kind of statement. She trusts. Not completely, and perhaps not ever completely. Trust that is broken before it is fully formed is the hardest kind to reconstruct, built in smaller increments and tested more cautiously and never quite arriving at the easy openness of an animal who simply never had reason to close. She is young and the work is ongoing, and there will be harder days ahead as she grows and her needs change and the world asks more of her than a corner and a toy and a set of familiar faces. But the foundation is there now, something to build on, something that wasn't there before. On a quiet afternoon near the end of the week, one of the senior caregivers sits outside the enclosure and watches her for a while without writing anything down. She is a few feet from the toy, not next to it, not reaching for it, just existing in the same space as it, which is its own kind of distance, its own kind of progress. She is watching something through the mesh, a bird maybe, or a shift in the light, or simply the particular quality of a late afternoon in a place that has slowly, imperfectly become familiar. She is not rocking, her hands are loose at her sides. She looks in this moment like an animal who is simply here, occupying her space in the world without bracing against it. The caregiver watches her for a long time. She thinks about the file, the sparse intake form, the few words in the circumstances column that gestured at a story no document could fully hold. She thinks about the first weeks, the corner, the toy held so tight the knuckles were pale. She thinks about the evening one of the younger staff stood outside the enclosure and couldn't leave. She thinks about a small hand reaching through the mesh toward something real. The gorilla turns her head, just slightly, and for a moment they look at each other through the mesh, the animal who learned to survive a loss too large for her age, and the human who stayed close enough and long enough to be trusted. Then the gorilla looks away, back to the light, back to whatever she was watching before. The toy sits in the corner where she left it. She doesn't reach for it. She wasn't holding a toy, she was holding on to what she lost.